adjusted his thick glasses for the 100th time that morning as he sat in the back corner of the Galactic Academy's xenobiology classroom. The 17-year-old human was smaller than most of his classmates, his dark hair perpetually messy despite his mother's attempts to tame it, before sending him off to the most prestigious educational institution in the galaxy. The classroom buzzed with the usual mix of languages and species. Tall, elegant with their silver skin, chatted in melodic tones, while hulking students compared notes with voices that sounded like grinding stone. Kept his head down, scribbling detailed diagrams of cellular structures in his notebook while trying to ignore the snickers from the group of students sitting 3 rows ahead. "Look at the little human," one of them whispered in accented standard, loud enough for half the class to hear. "Still playing with his picture books while we discuss real science." His pen stopped moving for just a moment before he continued his work. He'd heard worse in his 2 years at the academy. Being one of only 15 humans in a student body of over 3,000 made him an easy target. Most species viewed humans as the galaxy's members, barely evolved enough to deserve a seat at the civilized table. Professor, a elderly with 4 arms and skin like polished amber, called the class to attention. Her species was known for their analytical minds and had been studying xenobiology for over a millennium before humans had even discovered fire. "Today we will discuss the Serpentine Collective," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of centuries of experience. "These remarkable beings represent one of the galaxy's most successful predator species, having evolved perfect hunting instincts over millions of years." Looked up from his notes, genuinely interested. The Serpentine Collective was legendary throughout the galaxy, both feared and respected. They were master strategists, their elongated reptilian forms perfectly adapted for both stealth and combat. They were considered some of the most dangerous places in known space. "The Serpentines possess several unique adaptations," Professor continued, activating a holographic display that showed a 12-foot-long being with iridescent scales and multiple sets of arms. "Their heat-sensing organs can detect temperature variations as small as 1/10 of a degree. Their scales can shift color for perfect camouflage. Most importantly, they possess a collective consciousness that allows them to coordinate attacks with supernatural precision." A student raised a massive hand. "Professor, is it true that no prey has ever escaped from a serpentine hunting group?" "Technically correct," Professor replied. "In over 50,000 documented encounters, there has never been a recorded instance of successful evasion once a hunt begins. Their success rate remains at exactly 100%. The classroom fell silent. Even the arrogant looked impressed. However, was frantically scribbling notes, his mind racing with possibilities. He'd read about serpentine hunting patterns in his spare time, fascinated by their tactical approaches and biological advantages. "Their hunting chambers," the professor continued, "are carefully designed psychological environments. Serpentines don't simply kill their prey. They study it, test it, learn from it. The chambers contain various obstacles and hiding spots, allowing the serpentines to observe how different species react under extreme stress." Raised his hand tentatively. Professor looked surprised. The quiet human rarely spoke in class. "Yes, Mr. Professor, has anyone studied their hunting patterns from a game theory perspective? I mean, if their success rate is 100%, they might be operating under predictable algorithms that could theoretically be analyzed and..." Laughter erupted from the section. Al, their unofficial leader and son of a prominent diplomat, stood up with a mocking grin. "Listen to the little human," he said, his blue-scaled face twisted with amusement. "He thinks he can outsmart a species that's been perfecting their hunt for millions of years. Typical human arrogance." "I wasn't suggesting I could outsmart them," replied quietly, his cheeks reddening. "I was just wondering if anyone had applied mathematical models to their behavior patterns." "Mathematical models?" Al's friends joined his laughter. "Mathematics won't help you when you're staring at 12 feet of perfect predator, human boy. Your species barely understands basic interstellar travel, and you think you can analyze the Serpentine Collective." Professor raised one of her 4 hands for silence, but the damage was done. The entire class was staring at, some with amusement, others with second-hand embarrassment. Sank lower in his seat, wishing he'd kept his mouth shut. "The human makes an interesting point," Professor said diplomatically, though perhaps overly optimistic. The Serpentine Collective's hunting methods have been studied by the galaxy's finest minds for centuries. If there were exploitable patterns, they would have been discovered long ago. The rest of the class period passed in a blur. Took detailed notes about serpentine biology, social structure, and hunting techniques, but he could feel eyes on him throughout the lecture. When the class finally ended, he began packing his materials quickly, hopping to escape before anyone could corner him. He wasn't fast enough, and 3 of his friends blocked path to the door. It was nearly 7 feet tall, his blue scales gleaming under the classroom's artificial lights. Like all of his species, he possessed enhanced reflexes and strength that made him a formidable physical presence. "Going somewhere, little genius?" Al asked, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "I thought maybe you'd like to demonstrate your theoretical understanding of predator behavior." "I just want to go to my next class," said, trying to step around the group. One of Al's friends, a bulky named, blocked his path. "But we're so interested in your mathematical models," said with a grin that showed far too many teeth. "Maybe you'd like to test them in a more practical setting." Stomach dropped. He recognized the tone, the predatory gleam in their eyes. This wasn't going to be just another round of verbal bullying. The Academy had strict rules about violence between species, but those rules only worked if someone was around to enforce them. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," said carefully. "I wasn't trying to insult anyone or claim superiority. I was just curious about the academic aspects of—" "Curious?" Al interrupted, moving closer. "That's what your species is known for, isn't it? Sticking your noses where they don't belong, asking questions about things you couldn't possibly understand." The classroom had emptied except for their group. Even Professor had left, her 4 arms full of teaching materials, realized with growing dread that this had been planned. They'd waited for the right moment when no witnesses would be around. "You know what I find curious?" Al continued, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "How a species that's been in space for less than 2 centuries thinks it can waltz into our academy and start lecturing about predator behavior. Maybe you need a more hands-on education." Back toward the wall, his mind racing through options. He could try to run, but were much faster than humans. He could call for help, but his communicator was in his bag, which had knocked out of his hands when he tried to leave. Fighting wasn't an option. Even one could overpower him easily, let alone 4. "There's something you should know about serpentine hunting chambers, human," Al said, pulling out a small device that recognized with horror as an illegal transportation beacon. "They're not just theoretical constructs. My father's diplomatic connections have given our family access to some very interesting facilities." His blood turned to ice. "You can't be serious. The Academy would." "The Academy would what?" Al laughed. "Notice that the annoying human boy disappeared. Maybe assume he couldn't handle the academic pressure and went home to his little backward planet. My father sits on the Academy's board of trustees. Who do you think they'll believe?" The transportation beacon began to glow with an ominous red light. Had read about these devices. They were military-grade equipment that could instantly transport objects across vast distances. Possession by students was strictly forbidden, punishable by immediate expulsion and criminal charges. "This is insane," said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're talking about murder, even if your father has influence." "Who said anything about murder?" Al's grin widened. "You'll just be getting some practical experience with predator behavior. Consider it an advanced tutorial. If you're as smart as you think you are, maybe you'll figure out how to survive." The beacon's glow intensified. Could feel the familiar tingle of a transportation field beginning to form around him. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the process became irreversible. "Please," he said, abandoning any pretense of dignity. "This isn't necessary. I'll apologize to the class. I'll transfer to a different program, whatever you want." "Too late for that, human boy," said with satisfaction. "You should have thought about the consequences before trying to show off." Felt the transportation field lock onto his molecular structure. The sensation was like being dunked in ice water while every nerve in his body fired simultaneously. He tried to move, but the field had already begun breaking down his physical form for transport. "Give my regards to the Serpentines," Al called out as began to fade from view. "Try not to disappoint them with your performance." The last thing saw was the satisfied smirk before the world dissolved into streams of light and energy. The transportation process took only moments, but it felt like an eternity of falling through digital space while his consciousness struggled to maintain coherence. When the world reassembled around him, found himself lying on cold metal flooring in near-total darkness. The air was thick and humid, carrying scents he couldn't identify. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself to his feet and tried to assess his surroundings. He was in a large chamber, perhaps 50 meters square, with walls that seemed to be made of some dark, non-reflective material. Faint bioluminescent strips provided minimal lighting, creating pools of dim blue-green illumination separated by vast areas of shadow. The ceiling was lost in darkness above, and could hear the faint sound of air circulation systems working somewhere in the distance. His backpack had transported with him, a small mercy that meant he still had his notebook, pens, calculator, and the various technical manuals he always carried. More importantly, he had his emergency ration pack and water purification tablets, standard equipment for all Academy students during off-world fieldwork. Activated the small flashlight built into his student communicator and swept it around the chamber. The beam revealed a complex environment filled with obstacles, hiding spots, and what appeared to be multiple levels connected by ramps and bridges. It was exactly as Professor had described, a serpentine hunting chamber designed to provide an interesting environment for studying prey behavior. The reality of his situation hit him like a physical blow. He was alone, trapped in a chamber with beings that had never failed to kill their prey. Species that had faced the serpentines included trained soldiers, experienced hunters, and creatures with natural advantages far beyond anything humans possessed. None had survived. Sat down heavily on the metal floor, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his terror. He was going to die here, alone and far from home, because he'd been curious about hunting patterns and foolish enough to speak up in class. But as the initial panic subsided, something else began to take its place. Had always been the kind of person who dealt with fear by analyzing it, breaking it down into manageable components. It was how he'd survived 2 years of bullying at the academy, how he'd passed advanced courses despite being younger than most of his classmates, how he'd earned his place at the most prestigious school in the galaxy despite coming from a species most others considered primitive. He opened his notebook and began to write, documenting everything he could remember about serpentine biology and hunting behavior. If he was going to die here, he was going to approach the problem methodically. Maybe he couldn't survive what no one else had survived, but he could at least try to understand it. The serpentines were perfect predators, but perfection implied predictability. If their success rate was truly 100%, they must be following established patterns, relying on methods that had worked countless times before. And patterns, no matter how complex, could be analyzed and understood. Pulled out his calculator and began working through probability equations, trying to model what he knew about serpentine behavior. He had always been good with numbers, with seeing connections that others missed. Maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. As he worked, he began to hear something in the darkness beyond his small circle of light. A soft, rhythmic sound like scales moving against metal. The hunt had begun. Closed his notebook and moved deeper into the chamber, his student communicator's flashlight creating a narrow beam that barely penetrated the darkness ahead. The sound of scales against metal had grown closer, accompanied by something else, a low, harmonious humming that seemed to come from multiple sources at once. The collective consciousness. The serpentines were communicating with each other in frequencies just at the edge of human hearing, coordinating their approach. Had read about this phenomenon, but experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. The sound seemed to resonate in his bones, a constant reminder that he was facing beings who functioned as a single, unified intelligence. He found what appeared to be a maintenance alcove and quickly ducked inside, using the metal walls to muffle his breathing and heartbeat. From his hiding spot, he could observe a larger section of the chamber. The bioluminescent strips revealed a complex three-dimensional maze with platforms at different heights, connected by ramps and bridges that created multiple possible paths through the space. Forced himself to think analytically. The chamber's design wasn't random. It was carefully constructed to serve the serpentines' purposes. They wanted to study their prey, which meant they needed the prey to move, to make choices, to demonstrate their species' typical behavior patterns under stress. A flash of movement caught his eye. 12 feet of iridescent scales moved silently across a bridge 40 meters away, barely visible in the dim lighting. Even at that distance, could see the creature's impossible grace, the way it flowed like liquid mercury while maintaining perfect control. The serpentine paused for a moment, its head turning in a slow scan of the area, and caught a glimpse of eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The creature was beautiful in a terrifying way, its scales shifting through subtle color changes that would make it nearly invisible against different backgrounds. Watched, fascinated despite his fear, as the serpentine tested different camouflage patterns, its skin mimicking the metal surfaces, the bioluminescent lighting, even the shadows themselves. Then it was gone, vanishing so completely that began to doubt he'd seen it at all. The humming grew louder, more complex, and realized that what he was hearing was actually a sophisticated communication system. Different tones indicated different types of information: location reports, tactical observations, emotional states. It was like listening to a musical conversation conducted by beings who had spent millions of years perfecting their cooperative hunting strategies. Pulled out his notebook again, this time documenting his observations of serpentine behavior. They weren't simply pursuing him, they were gathering data. The way the first serpentine had moved, testing different camouflage patterns, suggested they were still in the assessment phase of their hunt. This realization sparked a new line of thought. If the serpentines studied their prey before killing them, it meant there was a period where they were more focused on observation than termination. They would want to see how he reacted to their presence, how his species behaved under stress, what survival strategies humans might employ. Began moving through the chamber more deliberately, no longer just trying to hide. If the serpentines wanted to study human behavior, he would give them something interesting to analyze. He climbed to one of the higher platforms, making no attempt to mask his movements. Once there, he sat down, pulled out his emergency rations, and calmly began to eat. It was exactly the opposite of what a panicked prey animal would do, and he hoped it would confuse the hunters enough to buy him some additional observation time. The strategy seemed to work. The humming shifted to a different pattern, one that sounded almost puzzled. Could sense movement in the shadows around him, but no attacks came. The serpentines were intrigued by his behavior. As he ate, continued his analysis of the chamber's layout. The design followed logical principles: multiple escape routes to encourage movement, dead ends to create tension, open areas where prey could be observed, and hiding spots that weren't quite secure enough to provide real safety. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. But psychological manipulation worked both ways. If could understand the serpentines' methods, perhaps he could use their own tactics against them. He finished his meal and began exploring the chamber more systematically, always staying in well-lit areas where he could be easily observed. He climbed structures, tested different paths, examined the various obstacles and hiding spots. To the serpentines, it probably looked like typical human curiosity. In reality, was mapping the environment and searching for anything that might give him an advantage. What he found surprised him. The chamber was incredibly sophisticated, filled with hidden sensors and monitoring equipment. The serpentines weren't just studying their prey's behavior. They were recording everything, analyzing biological responses, measuring stress hormones through airborne chemical detection. This was more than a hunting chamber. It was a research facility. The implications hit like a thunderbolt. The serpentines maintained their perfect success rate not just through superior hunting skills, but through accumulated knowledge. Every prey animal that entered these chambers provided data that made future hunts more efficient. They were continuously improving their methods, learning from each encounter. But that meant their tactics were based on historical data about how different species typically behaved. The serpentines expected their prey to follow predictable patterns: panic, hide, attempt escape, exhaust themselves through futile struggling, and finally succumb to superior predators. Had no intention of following that script. He found a comfortable spot on one of the middle platforms and sat down cross-legged. From his backpack, he one of his favorite technical manuals, a dense academic text on quantum mechanics that he'd been reading for fun. He opened his communicator's light to its widest setting, creating a comfortable reading environment, and began to study. The reaction was immediate. The harmonious humming stopped entirely, replaced by what sounded like confused chittering. Shadows moved more rapidly in his peripheral vision, and he could sense the serpentines repositioning themselves for better observation angles. They had never seen anything like this before. Their prey was supposed to be running, hiding, fighting, or cowering in terror. Instead, the small human was sitting calmly in plain sight, reading a book as if he were in a library rather than a death trap. Allowed himself a small smile as he read about wave-particle duality. The first rule of dealing with any system was to understand its assumptions. The Serpentine's hunting methods assumed prey that behaved like prey. By refusing to play that role, he was forcing them to adapt to something entirely outside their experience. Time passed, wasn't sure how much. The chamber had no windows, no obvious day-night cycle. The bioluminescent strips provided constant low-level illumination, and his communicator's battery gauge showed he'd been reading for approximately 3 hours. During that time, the Serpentine's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. The harmonious communication had been replaced by sharp, staccato sounds that suggested disagreement or confusion. Could see them moving more frequently, changing positions, clearly discussing how to handle this unprecedented situation. Finally, one of them made a direct approach. Looked up from his book to find a massive serpentine coiled on a platform 15 meters away. This close, he could see the incredible detail of its scales, each one a perfect hexagon that shifted through subtle color changes. The creature's 4 arms ended in hands that were clearly capable of both delicate manipulation and devastating violence. Its head was elegant and alien, with large eyes that reflected intelligence and predatory calculation. The Serpentine studied for a long moment, its head tilting in a gesture that seemed almost curious. When it spoke, its voice was a soft hiss that somehow carried clearly across the distance. "Interesting," it said in accented but perfectly clear standard. "You do not behave as expected, small prey creature." Marked his place in the book and looked up politely. "I'm not much for meeting expectations," he replied. "Would you mind if I ask you a question?" The Serpentine's head tilted further, a gesture was beginning to recognize as a sign of confusion. "You wish to ask questions in your final moments?" "Well, I hope these aren't my final moments," said conversationally. "But yes, I'm curious about something. You've achieved perfect success in these chambers for centuries, correct? Never lost a single prey animal." "This is true," the Serpentine's voice carried a note of pride. "We are the ultimate hunters. Our methods are flawless." "That's what I thought," nodded, returning to his book. "Very impressive." The silence stretched for several minutes, could sense the Serpentine's confusion growing. Finally, it spoke again. "You are not concerned about your situation?" Looked up again, adjusting his glasses. "Oh, I'm terrified," he said cheerfully. "Absolutely petrified, but being scared doesn't help me understand quantum tunneling effects, so I'm trying to focus on something useful." "Quantum tunneling?" The Serpentine's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "Fascinating stuff," said, holding up the book. "The idea that particles can pass through barriers that should be impossible to penetrate. Very counterintuitive, but the mathematics are quite elegant once you work through them." The Serpentine was silent for a long moment. Returned to his reading, but he could feel the creature's intense focus on him. Around the chamber, the confused chittering had resumed, and suspected he was the subject of a very unusual conversation among his captors. "You are educated?" the Serpentine finally asked. "I try to be," replied without looking up. "I'm a student at the Galactic Academy, second-year xenobiology major with concentrations in comparative psychology and mathematical modeling." "You study us. Among other things, your species is fascinating from an academic perspective. The collective consciousness, the perfect hunting record, the psychological sophistication of these chambers. It's like a predator evolution." The Serpentine moved closer, flowing down from its platform to a position only a few meters away. Could smell something like cinnamon and ozone, could hear the soft whisper of scales against metal. "You are not afraid of me," the Serpentine observed. Carefully bookmarked his page and set the manual aside. "I told you, I'm terrified, but fear is just another variable to account for. It doesn't change the fundamental parameters of the situation." "Parameters? Well, you're going to kill me eventually. That's what you do. But right now, you're in data collection mode, trying to understand what kind of creature I am. So I have some time to work with before we move to the termination phase of your protocol." The Serpentine's eyes widened slightly, an expression that somehow looked exactly like surprise despite the alien features. You understand our protocol? The basic outline, anyway. Assessment, psychological pressure, observation of stress responses, final confrontation. It's a very thorough approach. Adjusted his glasses again. I imagine you've refined it considerably over the... You speak of our methods as if they were academic subjects. Aren't they? Asked. You've created a perfect system for studying and eliminating prey. That's remarkable scientific achievement, even if the ethical implications are questionable. The humming around the chamber had stopped entirely. Suspected that every serpentine in the facility was listening to this conversation, trying to understand how their prey was analyzing their methods, as if he were reviewing a research paper. Tell me, continued, how many different species have you studied here? I'm curious about your sample size. The serpentine stared at him for a long moment. When it answered, its voice carried a note of bewilderment. 743 species, over 2,000 individual subjects. Impressive. And what's your standard observation period before termination? It varies depending on the species' behavior patterns. Some exhaust themselves quickly, others provide more interesting data. Nodded thoughtfully. So you're optimizing for information gathering, not just efficient killing. That makes sense from a research perspective. He pulled out his notebook and began writing. The serpentine watched, clearly fascinated, as documented their conversation. What are you recording? The creature asked. Your responses, said matter-of-factly. If I'm going to be your research subject, I might as well gather some data of my own. Fair's fair, right? The serpentine made a sound that might have been laughter, though it was unlike anything it had ever heard. You are unprecedented. I get that a lot, looked up from his notes. Would you mind telling me your name? I like to know who I'm talking to. I am Ra, the serpentine replied after a moment's hesitation. Hunt leader of the 3rd Research Collective. Nice to meet you, Ra. I'm human, obviously. Obviously? The hunt leader moved even closer, its movements careful and controlled. I must ask, are you attempting some form of psychological manipulation, some human strategy we have not encountered? Consider the question seriously. Not really, I'm just being myself, curious, analytical, probably too talkative for my own good. It's gotten me in trouble before. You analyze us as we analyze you. I suppose so, though I suspect your methods are considerably more sophisticated than mine. Ra was quiet for a moment, its head tilted in that gesture of confusion. Around the chamber, could hear soft conversations in the serpentine language, rapid exchanges that sounded urgent and puzzled. Finally, the hunt leader spoke again. In all our history, no prey has ever asked us questions. No prey has ever showed interest in our methods. No prey has ever, it paused, searching for words, treated this encounter as an academic exchange. Well, said, closing his notebook and looking directly into the serpentine's glowing eyes. I suppose that means I'm about to be part of your most interesting research data yet. The conversation with Ra continued for hours, during which learned more about serpentine society than most discovered in decades of study. The hunt leader seemed genuinely fascinated by his analytical approach to their situation, answering questions with an academic thoroughness that suggested this was the most intellectually stimulating interaction the creature had experienced in centuries. Discovered that the serpentines weren't simply predators, they were researchers. Each hunt was carefully documented, with detailed analyses of prey behavior, stress responses, survival strategies, and final moments. The data was shared across their collective consciousness and used to refine their methods. Your species presents unique challenges, Ra explained, shifting position to a more comfortable coil. Most prey creatures rely on instinctual responses when threatened. Humans appear to possess a capacity for rational analysis even under extreme stress. It's probably an evolutionary adaptation, suggested, making notes. Humans evolved in environments with multiple apex predators. Pure instinct wouldn't be enough. We needed the ability to think our way out of impossible situations. Yes, the serpentine said thoughtfully. This explains much about human expansion through the galaxy. You encounter threats that should overwhelm you, yet you find solutions. Paused in his writing, you've studied other humans. 2 previous subjects, yes. Both displayed similar analytical tendencies, though neither to your degree. They eventually succumbed to fear and exhaustion. What made them different from me? Ra considered the question carefully. They fought the situation, attempted escape, tried to negotiate, pleaded for release. You have done none of these things. Instead, you study us as we study you. Fighting seems counterproductive when you're completely outmatched, said pragmatically. I can't outrun you, can't overpower you, can't escape your facility, but I can learn something before I die. The hunt leader made that sound that might have been laughter again. You speak of your death with remarkable calm. Panic won't change the outcome, replied. Besides, this conversation is fascinating. I'm learning things about serpentine culture that no human has ever known. If I'm going to die anyway, I might as well satisfy my curiosity first. Around the chamber, could hear increasing activity. Other serpentines were positioning themselves for better observation angles, their communication frequencies shifting to patterns that suggested intense interest. He was apparently providing the most unusual research data in the facility's history. Tell me about your collective consciousness, said, genuinely curious. How does information sharing work? Is it telepathic or some form of biochemical communication? Ra hesitated. This information is typically reserved for our own species. I understand, professional secrets, though I have to point out that I'm not exactly going to share what I learn with anyone. The serpentine's head tilted again, that gesture now recognized as their equivalent of a puzzled frown. Your certainty about your fate is disturbing. Why, you've never failed to kill your prey. Basic logic suggests I won't be the exception. But you seem to accept this without distress. Adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. I think it's because I'm treating this as an academic experience rather than a personal threat. It's like reading about a historical battle, intellectually interesting but emotionally distant. Even though you are personally involved. Especially because I'm personally involved. It's the difference between reading about quantum mechanics and actually observing quantum effects. The personal experience makes the academic knowledge more real. Ra was quiet for a long moment, its eyes reflecting something that might have been confusion or concern. May I ask you a question that extends beyond our research protocols? Of course. Why are you here, not philosophically, but practically? How does a student from the Galactic Academy arrive in our research chamber? Sighed, his academic detachment wavering slightly. Bullying, essentially. Some classmates decided I needed a more practical education in predator behavior. They used an illegal transportation device to send me here. The quality of silence in the chamber changed. Could sense the other serpentine's attention focusing more intently, their communication patterns shifting to something that sounded almost like anger. You were sent here against your will, Ra's voice carried a sharp edge. By members of your own educational institution. By fellow students, yes, species politics. A lot of beings think humans don't belong in advanced academic settings. And they believed sending you to certain death would prove their point. Noticed the phrase, certain death, and filed it away for later analysis. I think they were more interested in removing what they saw as an irritating problem. They probably didn't think through the ethical implications. The hunt leader's scales shifted through a rapid series of color changes, patterns hadn't seen before. Around the chamber, the serpentine communication frequencies took on an urgency that suggested significant discussion was taking place. This disturbs us, Ra said finally. Our research depends on voluntary subjects who understand the risks they face. Looked up sharply from his notes. Voluntary subjects. Yes, species send their warriors, their volunteers, their condemned criminals. Individuals who choose to face our challenge, either for honor, research purposes, or as an alternative to other forms of punishment. We do not hunt innocents. The implications hit like a physical blow. You mean I'm not supposed to be here? Correct. Our arrangement with the Galactic Academy specifically excludes students unless they volunteer for advanced research participation. You were sent here illegally, without consent or proper protocols. Felt his carefully maintained academic detachment cracking. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn into territory that changed everything about his situation. What does that mean for me? He asked quietly. Ra's communication with the other serpentines intensified, rapid exchanges in frequencies that made teeth ache. Finally, the hunt leader spoke again. It means we have a problem. Our research protocols do not account for unwilling subjects who were placed here through criminal means. We must consult the collective council. How long does that take? Time is difficult to measure in collective consultations. Perhaps hours, perhaps days. Our consciousness operates on different temporal scales than individual awareness. Nodded, trying to process this information. So I wait while you decide what to do with me. You wait, Ra confirmed, though I suspect you will continue to study us while you wait. Probably, admitted, it's how I deal with stress. The hunt leader made that laughing sound again. You are perhaps the most unusual individual ever to enter our chambers. Even without our research protocols, observing your behavior provides valuable insights into human psychology. Pulled out another textbook, this one on comparative. Mind if I ask you about your decision-making processes while I wait? I'm curious about how collective consciousness handles ethical dilemmas. You wish to interview us? If you don't mind. I figure this might be my only chance to get first-hand information about one of the galaxy's most enigmatic species. Ra settled into a more comfortable position, clearly preparing for an extended conversation. Very well, ask your questions. We will see what answers we can provide. What followed was the most extraordinary academic discussion of life. The hunt leader explained how serpentine collective consciousness functioned, how decisions were made across millions of linked minds, how information was processed and integrated. Learned about their history, their culture, their complex relationships with other species. In return, he shared his own knowledge about human society, about the challenges of being a young species in a galaxy dominated by older civilizations, about the academic politics that had led to his current predicament. The conversation evolved into a genuine exchange of information between two intelligent beings trying to understand each other's perspectives. Hours passed unnoticed, filled page after page of notes while Ra answered his questions with increasing openness. Around them, other serpentines occasionally contributed to the discussion, offering additional perspectives or clarifying complex concepts. It was during a detailed explanation of serpentine mathematics that noticed something significant. The collective consultation about his situation had been ongoing in the background, but now he could hear the communication patterns changing, settling into what sounded like consensus. Ra paused mid-sentence, its attention turning inward for several minutes. When it refocused on, something had changed in its posture and expression. The collective council has reached a decision, the hunt leader announced. Closed his textbook and set it aside. What's the verdict? Your presence here violates multiple agreements. The individuals who sent you committed serious crimes against both human and serpentine law. However, you have already been exposed to classified information about our society and research methods. Felt his stomach drop. So you can't release me because I know too much. The situation is more complex than that, Ra replied. Your knowledge of our methods could potentially be valuable to other species, but your behavior here has been so unprecedented that the collective believes you represent a unique research opportunity. What kind of opportunity? You have demonstrated the ability to interact with us as equals rather than as prey. This suggests possibilities for formal academic collaboration that we have never before considered. The hunt leader's scales shifted to patterns was beginning to recognize as indicators of excitement. The collective wishes to offer you a choice. Waited, sensing that his next few decisions would determine not just his survival, but possibly his entire future. You may return to your academy, Ra continued, with the understanding that your knowledge of our society must be kept strictly confidential. Or you may remain here as our first research partner, helping us develop new methodologies for studying consciousness and behavior. And if I choose to leave, the individuals who sent you here will be prosecuted under galactic law. You will be provided with evidence of their crimes and offered legal support for any civil proceedings you wish to pursue. Considered his options carefully. Returning to the academy meant facing Al and his friends, dealing with the same species politics that had nearly killed him. But staying meant abandoning his original academic plans, committing to a collaboration with beings most of the galaxy considered dangerous predators. If I stayed, he said slowly, what would that involve? You would become our window into human psychology, helping us understand how your species thinks and reacts. In return, We would teach you our methods of analysis and observation. You would be the first outsider ever granted access to our complete research databases. It was an unprecedented opportunity. We'd be working with some of the most sophisticated behavioral researchers in the galaxy, with access to data collected over millions of years of study. The academic value was beyond calculation. Would I be able to publish my findings? With appropriate restrictions to protect sensitive information, yes. We believe the galaxy could benefit from better understanding of psychology. Looked around the chamber that had been designed as his tomb, but had instead become the site of the most fascinating conversations of his life. In a few hours, he had learned more about consciousness, behavior, and relations than he could have discovered in years of traditional study. "I need some time to think about it," he said finally. "Of course," Ra replied. "This is perhaps the most important decision you will make in your lifetime. Consider carefully." Opened his notebook to a fresh page and began writing out the pros and cons of each option. It was, he reflected, probably the first time anyone had ever used cost-benefit analysis to decide whether to become a research partner with the galaxy's most feared predators. But then again, approaching impossible situations analytically had served him well so far. Spent the next several hours working through his decision with the same methodical approach he applied to complex mathematical problems. He filled multiple pages with analysis, weighing variables and considering long-term implications, while Ra observed his process with fascination. "You approach this choice as you would a research problem," the hunt leader observed. "Everything is a research problem if you think about it the right way," replied, reviewing his notes. "The question is whether I can gather enough data to make an informed decision. What additional information do you require?" Looked up from his calculations. "I need to understand what happened to the other humans who were brought here. You mentioned 2 previous subjects. What were their circumstances?" Ra's scales shifted through subtle color patterns that had learned indicated careful consideration. The first was a convicted criminal sent by human authorities as an alternative to execution. He had committed multiple murders and was considered irredeemable by your justice system. "And the second?" "A volunteer researcher from your academy, actually. Dr. Sarah, a specialist in comparative psychology who requested permission to experience our methods firsthand." Dropped his pen. "That's my surname, are you saying?" "Your relation, yes. Your cousin, according to her documentation. She volunteered for this study approximately 18 months ago." The revelation hit like a physical blow. His cousin Sarah, who had disappeared while conducting research for her doctoral thesis. The family had been told she died in a shuttlecraft accident, but apparently the truth was very different. "What happened to her?" asked quietly. "She survived our initial protocols, as you have. But unlike you, she chose to attempt escape rather than engage in dialogue. The pursuit and eventual termination took several days." Felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You killed her." "We followed our established protocols. She knew the risks when she volunteered." Ra paused. "However, her final analysis of our methods proved remarkably insightful. Her research notes contributed significantly to our understanding of human psychological resilience." "She left research notes." "Extensive documentation, yes. Her work influenced our decision to offer you the collaboration opportunity. She theorized that humans might be capable of academic partnership with our species under the right circumstances." Stared at his notebook, his carefully organized pros and cons list suddenly meaningless. His cousin hadn't just died here. She had paved the way for his current situation. Her sacrifice had created the possibility that he might survive what she could not. "May I see her research?" he asked. "If you choose to remain and join our collaboration, yes. Her work would become part of your academic foundation." Returned to his analysis, but now with a personal dimension that changed everything. Choosing to stay meant honoring Sarah's sacrifice, continuing work she had died to make possible. Leaving meant abandoning the opportunity she had created with her life. After another hour of calculation and consideration, made his decision. "I'll stay," he said simply. Ra's scales brightened perceptibly. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be with incomplete data, but the research potential outweighs the risks, especially given what my cousin accomplished here." "Excellent," The hunt leader's communication with the other serpentines shifted to frequencies that sounded celebratory. You should know that the collective is extremely pleased with this outcome. We have hoped for decades to find an individual capable of true academic partnership. What happens next? First, we must arrange for your transition from prey status to researcher status. This involves certain ceremonial protocols that formalize your position within our society. Pulled out a fresh notebook. Tell me about these protocols. I want to document everything. What followed was introduction to the complex ceremonial structure of serpentine society. He learned that their culture was built around elaborate rituals that formalized relationships, established responsibilities, and created binding agreements between individuals and groups. The ceremony that would transform him from research subject to research partner was particularly intricate, involving symbolic elements that represented death and rebirth. Would symbolically die as prey and be reborn as a collaborative consciousness, granted limited access to the collective's shared knowledge. The process involves temporary neural interface with our collective consciousness, Ra explained. You will experience our methods of thought and analysis firsthand. However, human neural architecture may not be compatible with our interfaces. What are the risks? Unknown, you would be the first non-serpentine to attempt such interface. Possibilities range from complete success to neural damage or death. Wrote down the information matter-of-factly. Success rate estimates. Based on comparative neurological analysis, approximately 40% probability of successful interface, 30% probability of temporary interface with minor side effects, 30% probability of serious complications. So roughly 1 chance in 3 that this kills me. Correct. Continued taking notes. When would this ceremony take place? When you feel ready. There is no urgency. The collective has waited for this opportunity and can wait longer if necessary. Considered the timeline. He had already been missing from the academy for over 24 hours. Search protocols would begin soon, though given Al's father's influence, any investigation might be delayed or misdirected. I'm ready now, he said. No point in postponing the inevitable. Ra's head tilted in that gesture of surprise. You do not wish time to prepare, to consider the implications further. I've been preparing my whole life for something like this, replied. Every equation I've solved, every theory I've studied, every question I've asked has been leading toward understanding how consciousness works across species barriers. This is just the next logical step. The hunt leader communicated rapidly with the other serpentines, their conversation frequencies shifting through patterns that suggested both excitement and concern. Finally, Ra spoke again. The collective agrees to proceed. The ceremony will take place in our primary research chamber, with full monitoring to ensure your safety. Was led through a series of passages that revealed the true scale of the serpentine facility. What he had assumed was a simple hunting chamber was actually part of a vast research complex that extended deep underground. The corridors were filled with sophisticated equipment, analysis laboratories, and data storage systems that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. The primary research chamber was breathtaking in its complexity. Walls covered with displays showed real-time data streams from across the galaxy, tracking behavioral patterns of dozens of species. The center of the room contained a circular platform surrounded by neural interface equipment that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced. Counted at least 30 serpentines in the chamber, individuals whose scales showed the distinctive patterns he had learned indicated advanced age and high academic rank. These were the senior researchers of the collective, gathered to witness an unprecedented event. Before we begin, Ra said, you should understand that this interface will change you. Exposure to collective consciousness, even temporarily, alters individual thought patterns. You will retain your human perspective, but you will also carry elements of our analytical methods for the rest of your life. Will I be able to disconnect from the interface? Yes, the connection can be severed at any time. However, the knowledge gained cannot be removed. Nodded, moving toward the interface platform. That seems fair. I wouldn't want to forget what I learn here. The interface equipment was elegant in its alien design, featuring bioneural connectors that would link directly with his nervous system. Lay down on the platform, allowing the serpentine technicians to attach the necessary connections. "Are you ready?" Ra asked. "Ready," replied, though his heart was racing with anticipation and fear. The interface activated gradually, beginning with subtle sensations that felt like gentle electrical currents running through his nervous system. Then, suddenly, his individual consciousness expanded exponentially. He was no longer alone in his own mind. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of individual serpentine consciousnesses connected with his thoughts, sharing knowledge, memories, and analytical processes. The experience was overwhelming and exhilarating simultaneously. Could suddenly perceive patterns in behavior and psychology that he had never imagined. The collective consciousness operated on multiple levels simultaneously, processing vast amounts of data while maintaining individual perspectives within the greater whole. It was like discovering a new form of mathematics, one that described the fundamental structures of thought and awareness. Through the collective interface, gained access to millions of years of accumulated research data. He experienced the serpentine's first contact with other species, their gradual development of sophisticated hunting and research methods, their ongoing quest to understand the nature of consciousness itself. But what surprised him most was the discovery that the serpentines were not the cold, calculating predators most species believed them to be. They were passionate researchers driven by genuine curiosity about the nature of awareness and intelligence. Their hunting protocols served a larger purpose, understanding how different forms of consciousness responded to extreme stress. The data they had collected was already being used to develop better psychological treatment methods, more effective educational techniques, and improved communication protocols between species. The serpentines weren't just studying their prey. They were working to understand consciousness itself, with the goal of improving life for all sentient beings. Also gained access to his cousin Sarah's complete research files. Her work had been brilliant, developing theories about human consciousness that had influenced decades of serpentine research. She had died not as a victim, but as a pioneer whose work was still saving lives across the galaxy. The interface lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When the connection gradually faded, found himself back in his own individual consciousness, but profoundly changed. He could still think in human terms, but he now also carried analytical methods and perspectives that no human had ever possessed. "How do you feel?" Ra asked. Sat up slowly, his mind still processing the extraordinary experience. "Different," he said finally, "like I've been upgraded with new cognitive software." The integration was successful. You now carry elements of our collective consciousness while maintaining your individual human perspective. This makes you uniquely qualified to serve as a bridge between our species. Looked around the research chamber with new understanding. Every piece of equipment, every data stream, every analytical protocol now made perfect sense to him. He could see the elegant logic behind the serpentine's methods, the careful balance between scientific rigor and ethical consideration. "What's my first assignment?" he asked. Ra's scales showed patterns of satisfaction and anticipation. "We have received reports of unusual behavioral patterns among human settlements in the Outer Rim. The collective believes these patterns may indicate the emergence of a new form of consciousness. We need someone who understands both human psychology and our analytical methods to investigate." Smiled, feeling more excited about his future than he had ever felt about anything in his life. "When do we leave?" 6 months later, stood before the Galactic Academy's Board of Trustees, presenting research findings that would revolutionize the field of psychology. The young human who had once been dismissed as a geeky dreamer now carried himself with quiet confidence, his enhanced analytical capabilities evident in every word he spoke. "The data clearly demonstrates that consciousness operates on multiple levels simultaneously," explained, gesturing to holographic displays that showed complex behavioral patterns. "What we've traditionally viewed as simple stimulus-response mechanisms are actually sophisticated cognitive processes that vary dramatically between species." The board members listened with rapt attention. Among them sat Al's father, Ambassador N, whose blue scales had paled considerably since learning of his son's illegal actions. The investigation that followed's disappearance had uncovered a network of student violence that reached into several prominent families. "Mr.," said Chancellor Aura, a distinguished who had led the academy for over 2 centuries, These findings suggest fundamental revisions to our understanding of intelligence and awareness. How do you propose we implement these insights practically? Smiled, his confidence unwavering. Through collaborative research programs that bring together different species' analytical methods. Each form of consciousness offers unique perspectives that, when combined, provide more complete understanding than any single approach. He activated another display showing comparative data from human, serpentine, and cognitive processes. For example, human pattern recognition combined with serpentine collective analysis and temporal perception creates predictive models that none of our species could develop independently. Ambassador and raised a trembling hand. Mister, may I ask, how do you find it possible to work with beings who were prepared to kill you? Considered the question carefully. Because they weren't trying to kill me, Ambassador. They were trying to understand consciousness under extreme conditions. The difference is significant. But surely you must feel some resentment. The only resentment I feel is toward the individuals who sent me there illegally, replied calmly. The Serpentines conducted themselves according to their established protocols. They couldn't have known I was an unwilling subject. The ambassador's scales darkened with shame. His son Al was currently serving a 5-year sentence for illegal transportation and attempted murder, along with his 3 co-conspirators. The scandal had destroyed the family's diplomatic standing and served as a warning to other students who might consider similar actions. Tell us about the Outer Rim investigation, Chancellor Ara requested, clearly eager to move past the uncomfortable topic. His expression brightened. One of the most fascinating discoveries of my career. We identified 17 human settlements that were spontaneously developing collective consciousness similar to serpentine neural networking, but with distinctly human characteristics. He showed brain scan data that revealed unprecedented neural connectivity patterns. These communities faced severe isolation and resource limitations that forced them to develop enhanced cooperative strategies. Over several generations, they evolved shared consciousness while maintaining individual identity. This is revolutionary, murmured Dr. N, the Academy's leading consciousness researcher. It suggests that collective awareness isn't limited to species that evolved it naturally. Exactly, agreed. And it's not just humans. We've identified similar developments among isolated mining communities, exploration crews, and even mixed-species settlements. Consciousness appears to be far more adaptable than we previously understood. The presentation continued for 2 hours, during which shared discoveries that would influence relations for generations. His research had already led to new diplomatic protocols, improved educational methods, and better treatment approaches for various psychological conditions. When he finished, the board erupted in enthusiastic discussion. Multiple institutions were already competing for opportunities to collaborate with the Serpentine research collectives, and found himself in the unprecedented position of being humanity's primary liaison with one of the galaxy's most enigmatic species. Chancellor Ara called for order. Mister, the board wishes to offer you a formal position as Director of Consciousness Studies, with full research authority and unlimited funding for collaborative projects. Bowed respectfully. I'm honored, Chancellor. However, I should mention that I won't be able to accept a permanent position at any single institution. Why not? Because my work requires constant travel between different consciousness research facilities. I spend equal time with human institutions, serpentine collectives, meditation centers, and various other species research groups. My value comes from being able to bridge these different approaches. The Chancellor nodded understandingly. Then perhaps a consulting arrangement. We would very much like to maintain formal ties with your research. That would be acceptable, agreed. Though I should warn you that my methods tend to challenge conventional academic approaches. Doctorin laughed. Mister, your methods have already overturned half the assumptions in my field. I think we can handle a few more surprises. After the meeting concluded, gathered his materials and prepared to return to his transport ship. His next destination was a newly discovered species called the, whose crystalline neural structures presented entirely new challenges for consciousness research. As he walked through the Academy's halls, noticed the changes in how other students regarded him. Where once he had faced dismissive glances and barely concealed contempt, he now encountered respectful nods and genuine curiosity. Several students approached him with research questions, treating him as an authority rather than an oddity. "Mister," a young student caught up with him near the transport platform. "I'm writing my thesis on consciousness adaptation, and I was wondering if you might review my initial findings." Paused, remembering his own student days and the loneliness of being constantly dismissed by his peers. "I'd be happy to take a look. What's your research focus?" "Collective decision-making in crisis situations. I'm studying how different species coordinate responses to emergencies." "Fascinating topic. Send me your data, and I'll provide feedback within a week." The student's silver features brightened with gratitude. "Thank you, this means so much to me." As continued toward his transport, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. The shy, bookish human who had once hidden in classroom corners was now one of the galaxy's leading consciousness researchers, equally comfortable in human academic settings and serpentine collective discussions. His communicator chimed with an incoming message from Ra. The hunt leader had become not just a research partner but a genuine friend, their different perspectives creating insights that neither could have achieved alone. The message read, "The collective has identified anomalous consciousness patterns in the Andromeda relay stations. The patterns suggest possible contact with extragalactic intelligence. How soon can you join the investigation team?" Smiled as he boarded his transport ship. Extragalactic intelligence would present entirely new challenges for consciousness research, requiring analytical methods that combined insights from every species they had studied. "Prepare for departure to Serpentine Research Station 7, he instructed his ship's navigation system. "Maximum velocity." As the transport launched from the Academy platform, opened his latest research journal, and began documenting preliminary theories about extragalactic consciousness. The unknown always excited him, whether it was a new mathematical equation or an entirely alien form of awareness. His communicator chimed again with another message, this one from the human settlements in the Outer Rim. The communities he had studied were requesting his assistance in developing educational protocols for their emerging collective consciousness. 3 different research institutions wanted him to consult on meditation enhancement projects. A mining consortium needed help with worker psychological adaptation to extreme environments. Realized with satisfaction that he had more research opportunities than he could possibly pursue in several lifetimes. The analytical methods he had gained through serpentine neural interface allowed him to work with any species, bridging gaps in understanding that had persisted for. Most importantly, his work was making practical differences in beings' lives across the galaxy. The consciousness studies he pioneered were being used to treat psychological disorders, improve educational outcomes, enhance diplomatic relations, and help isolated communities develop more effective cooperation strategies. As his transport entered hyperspace, reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. Being thrown into a serpentine hunting chamber had seemed like certain death, but it had actually been the beginning of the most fulfilling career he could have imagined. He opened his original notebook, the one he had carried into the hunting chamber 6 months earlier, and read his first observations about serpentine behavior. His handwriting looked childish compared to the sophisticated analytical methods he now employed, but those initial notes had marked the beginning of everything that followed. On the final page, he wrote a new entry. "Personal note. Today I realized that the most dangerous thing that ever happened to me was also the best thing that ever happened to me. Being underestimated by bullies led to an opportunity no human has ever had before. Sometimes the worst situations contain the greatest possibilities, if you're willing to approach them analytically rather than emotionally. The key to surviving impossible situations isn't superior strength or advanced technology. It's the willingness to understand your circumstances completely, even when those circumstances seem designed to destroy you. Especially then. Every challenge is a research problem. Every threat is a learning opportunity. Every impossible situation contains data that can change everything if you're curious enough to look for it." Closed the notebook and settled back for the long journey to Serpentine Research Station 7. Somewhere ahead lay mysteries that would challenge everything he thought he knew about consciousness and intelligence. He could hardly wait to begin unraveling them. Behind him, the Galactic Academy continued its ancient mission of education and research. but now with new methods and perspectives that a geeky human boy had helped discover. Students from dozens of species studied consciousness using techniques that combined human curiosity, serpentine analysis, and collaborative insights from across the galaxy. And in a small corner of the Academy's vast library, a collection of research journals documented the extraordinary transformation of from dismissed student to galactic pioneer in consciousness studies. The journals were already becoming required reading for students interested in consciousness research, serving as inspiration for anyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed. The last entry in the collection was a simple note. The most important discoveries come not from avoiding dangerous situations, but from approaching them with enough curiosity to see the opportunities they contain. Sometimes the best way to survive being thrown to the predators is to become fascinated by how they think. Smiled as he read the message from Ra about extragalactic consciousness patterns. Whatever waited for him at the research station, he knew he would approach it the same way he had approached everything since that day in the hunting chamber, with analytical curiosity, methodical observation, and the absolute certainty that understanding was always possible, no matter how impossible the situation might seem. The universe was full of consciousness patterns waiting to be discovered, and intended to study every single one of them.